Our family had a wonderful experience this past Shabbos. As you may or may not know, my wife, she works in the local all-girls high school here in Houston. And once a year, they have a retreat. They have a Shabbaton. The whole school, all the students, and most of the staff and their families, they go to some retreat, to some faraway place, to some ranch, to some bucolic location, and they have this wonderful Shabbos that they spend together. And this year, so we go, and this year we went to this incredible ranch somewhere in the middle of Texas, 1,200 acres, rolling hills, all this incredible the amenities, animals, the Texas Longhorns. My kid told me he saw 7 zebras. It's owned by this amazing Texan, built like a bull, 81 years old, Mr. George Eberly. He tells us that he has 6 sons and a daughter, and everyone has a place in the ranch. Whenever one of the new kids wants to build a house, they just knock down 5 acres and build a house there. It's got enormous lakes and expansive hunting grounds. And there's this one large central building that has several dining halls that can accommodate hundreds of people. Plus it has all sorts of sleeping accommodations there. We were actually scheduled to go last week, but there was the big storms, and they told us that more than 100 trees fell down on the ranch, and they lost power. So we rescheduled for this past week, and it was just wonderful. It was lovely. It's so scenic, and it's just picturesque. You're driving along this narrow, winding road through these forests to get to the center of the ranch, and it's just beautiful. And they have this like a golf course, and they got the pickleball courts and boating and a swimming pool. And I'm thinking, I could really get used to this. Wouldn't it be nice to have like your own ranch, the Walby compound? This is where we'll wait out the apocalypse. But anyhow, that was some of the thoughts that I had. I'll tell you why they went away in a second. But they decided to put the Walbys, who came with a large family, to put us in a different house. So everyone was in the center compound, in the center building. It had, where they had all the meals and the davening and all the various different programs that they did. And at the edge of the building, they had all the different rooms where everyone was staying. But we were like a half a mile away from where everyone else was staying. And they said, "It's great. You'll have privacy. It'll be so nice." Of course, we have to do that walk on Shabbos, and it's kind of a nice walk in the sweltering heat. So Mr. Eberly, he's like, "Oh, no, this is not walkable. This you got to drive." So you don't understand. With Shabbos, we're not going to drive. No problem. I'll leave you the keys to my golf cart. You just drive the golf. You don't get it. You don't get it. We're going to have to do this walk. But the nice thing about it is that the entire property is enclosed with a gate. So halachically speaking, it's one domain. It's one property. So it has like a natural eruv. So we're taking the kids and pushing the strollers, and it's just wonderful. It's serene. It's idyllic. And then before Shabbos, I was cured of my interest in making a Walby ranch, Walby compound. Of course, you think about it, it's not really practical because, just the amount of mowing you have to do to mow the lawn and to manage it, to manicure it. It's just not really for me. But before Shabbos, I'm giving the kids a bath. And I see this full of bugs and all these animals, no problem. I see in the house that we're staying, I see a tiny little scorpion. I'm not kidding. I'm not making this up. And I take out my phone, I take a picture and Google it, and it gives me the name of this scorpion. It's highly venomous. This totally cured my interest in moving out to them. I'm a city folk. We're the real soft city folks. So I call up George. He's like, "What's the big deal? Just go squash it." I said, "You don't understand. You don't understand the kind of people we are. We're not going to go squash it." He came and he killed it with a paper towel. He's like, "Well, it's only a little baby. We actually pay to spray with the exterminator. The exterminator comes once a month to spray the exterior of every building. But anyhow, it's just not for me. Go every once in a while. Some people are not cut out for that sort of life. But it was a beautiful Shabbos, and we had a full schedule. And we actually did not have a minyan. There was not a minyan of men. So the davening was done without a minyan, but with the davening and the meals. And there was all sorts of Torah educational content. Now, this is our third year in a row joining. And every year they ask me to do something, to speak, to join the panel, to do a presentation. And this year they said, listen, you're great, but you're better by yourself. You're not really a panel person. Apparently, last year when I was on the panel, I didn't kind of behave with the proper protocol for panels. I had dominated it a bit. So I was constantly interjecting and being a little argumentative, and I spoke out of turn. Apparently, I don't even remember, but apparently I had an opinion about everything. They said to me, listen, Walby, you're okay. You're just not great for panels. You speak by yourself. Prepare a speech. So I prepared a speech. This is a weekend, a couple of days ago. And I said it over on the Sunday class. The 5 fascinating questions. I assembled 5 fascinating questions from each one of the books of the Torah. And we'll release it on the podcast sometime soon. That was the plan. But of course, the Shabbaton last week was rescheduled to this week. And I decided to alter my speech. So Friday night, they gave me a speech. I said I'm going to do something exotic, something esoteric, a wild card. So this past Shabbos was Parsha's Bahar. And it starts off with the laws of Shemitah and Yovel. Shemitah means every 7th year, there's no agricultural work done in the land of Israel. And then so you have 6 years of work, and the 7th year, it's like the Shabbos schedule. 6 days of work and 1 day of no work. 6 years of work, and then there's the Shemitah year, 1 year of no work. But then there's 7 cycles of the Shemitah, and then there's the double Shemitah, because then year 49 is the Shemitah year, but year 50 is the Yovel year. That's the mitzvah at the beginning of this past week's Parsha. Now there's a very interesting, obscure, esoteric, and fascinating opinion that's found in the literature. The Ramban in this week's Parsha, he hints at it. And he says, listen, I'll tell you, it's a secret. I can't really tell you about it, but I'll tell you a little bit, and listen very carefully, because I'm saying it in a cryptic fashion. And the Ibn Ezra talks about it, and the Rabbeinu Bechai talks about it, and the Sefer Chinuch talks about it. But it's like one of those secret ideas that most people know nothing about. The idea is that the world is designed to follow a Shemitah cycle. How so? The Talmud tells us that this world, it's a 6,000-year enterprise. That's it. 6,000 years. And then there is 1 millennium of destruction. So there's a 7,000-year world. It's going to exist the way we understand it existing for 6,000 years. And then for the 7th millennium, it will be destroyed. What does that mean? I don't know. The Talmud talks about how the world will be covered in water, whatever that means. And the righteous, they'll be granted wings to fly, and they'll fly for 1,000 years without getting tired. I don't know what that means at all, but that's what the Talmud says. 6,000 years, and then 1,000 years of destruction. So the sources that the Ramban invokes and others talk about it, they say that actually the universe is designed to follow a Shemitah cycle. Just as, year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the Shemitah cycle, everyone works. No work is restricted in the field. And then comes year 7 and it's a year off. And then you go back to year 8. It's a year on through 14, which is a second Shemitah, and so on. Year 21 is a Shemitah, then 22 is not a Shemitah. And then 28 and 35 and 42 and 49. That's how it works. That system exists on a millennium timeline. 6 millennia of work of the world existing, and then 1 millennia of destruction. 1 millennium of destruction. And then it's going to be rebuilt. Just like in year 8, there is work to be done on the field. On the 8th millennium, there's work to be done again in the world. The world will be rebuilt, and so on. And it's going to exist for 7 cycles, and then finally it will go to the Yovel cycle. So it's really a 50,000 year world. Now, this concept has enormous implications. And in my talk on Friday night, I focused on the age of the universe dilemma. So how old is the universe? No one seems to know exactly. If you were to ask the Greeks 2,500 years ago, they would say, well, the world's eternal. Olam Kadmon. The world's been around forever. It's turtles all the way down. Today, that's not a tenable position because we know the world's expanding. We have the cosmic background radiation that we could pick up. It seems like the scientific consensus today is that the world had a beginning. As we always like to say, it took a long time, but the world came around to accepting the first word of the Torah as being authoritative. Bereshis, there was a beginning. But how old is the universe? Well, the scientists don't really know. Is it 13.8 billion years? Is it 15.4 billion years? It's hard to be precise. But regardless, I asked the students on Friday night, well, how old do we think the universe is? So one brave student said, well, 5,784 years. So I said, well, how do you know that? So she responded, because that's what it says on the torch calendar. It says it on the torch calendar. So I said, that's a very good answer. That's a very, very good response. But I told them, I said, listen, we don't have any sources that tell us the year that we're in. The way it was determined is simply by adding up the age of Adam when his son Seth, Shais, was born, and adding up the years that Seth lived till his son was born, and then add the years to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation, and just assume that that's the age since Adam, since the beginning. But then I said, well, do we imagine that Adam had a baby on his birthday? He was 130 years old when Seth was born, but could he have been 130 in 5 months? And Seth could have been at the age that he was when his son Enosh was born with a couple of months. So if you add up all the months, well, maybe you have more than 5,784 years. But I said, regardless, there is a tradition that we have. That's the year 5784. Let's say, give or take, a couple of dozen years in each direction. We're not exactly sure. Even traditionally, when people talk about the age of the world, let's say, which is perhaps a different thing than the age of the universe, they add the qualifier lefid kabbalos, and as per our tradition, we don't know exactly. But regardless, 5,784, give or take, that's a very different number than 13.8, 15.4 billion years. That's not a rounding error. So is there a way to reconcile these two positions? And perhaps you may say, well, why is it important to recognize? We have our opinion, and we're right, and we don't care what they say. They've been wrong so many times before. How many theories of the scientists were superseded? Don't you know? They're wrong all the time. So maybe they're wrong here as well. So that's perhaps an approach that can be pursued. But nevertheless, we do find that our sages have wrestled with this question. And if they wrestle with it, we can wrestle with it as well. And I start to list some of the various different reconciliations that exist. So the most common answer to this question is that Adam, on the day that he was born, he ate from a fruit, from a tree. Most humans, the way we know of them, the day they're born, they cannot eat any fruit from any tree. Did Adam have teeth to chew from the fruit of the tree? You imagine he did. Babies born today most of them, all of ours, are born without any teeth and without the ability to chew. So what that means is that God created not a baby world, but an existing world. Adam was created as an adult. And were there trees around? Yes, not just little saplings, not just little plants placed in the ground. It was a fully dynamic world. And if you were to saw open one of the trees and count the rings, you would find that it had many rings. Why? Because God did not create a baby world. He created an old world. So it could be both, several thousand years old, and it could also be billions of years old, because God created a billions-year-old world. That's one answer, very common answer to this question. A second approach relates to the 6 mysterious days that precede Adam. We look at a day as being measured by the sunrise to sunset, to the next morning sunrise. Well, if the sun only appears on day 4 in Genesis, how does Sunday become Monday? What's that process like? Maybe that's 1 billion years or 10. And that approach has also been developed, and it is presented and argued by very reputable sources. And then I told him, there's another answer based upon the Shemitah cycle system found in the ancient literature. The Talmud says explicitly that before the creation of the world, there was something. The Talmud says, for example, that Moshe, when he ascended to heaven to get the Torah, this is in the book of Shabbos, Talmud Shabbos, page 88b. He wanted to get the Torah, and the angels protested, saying, how can you, Almighty God, give the Torah to Moshe, to humanity? This treasure that was in your treasure house for 974 generations before the world was created. And you want to give it to flesh and blood? The Talmud says explicitly that the creation of Torah preceded the world by 974 generations. Now, what that means, I don't know, but it does say explicitly that there was something that preceded the world. There were 974 generations. Similarly, the Midrash says that if you look at the end of Genesis, chapter 1, and God saw, and behold, all that he had made was exceedingly good. Vayar Elokim Tzvah tov me'od, says the Midrash. God, so to speak, is assessing his creation, and he's saying it's very good. Says the Midrash, well, there were other worlds. God created other worlds and destroyed them. He wasn't happy with them, so to speak. And when he created this world, he declared, behold, this one is Tov Ma'od, is exceedingly good. So again, the Medrash, this is a Medrash. This is not some sort of esoteric source. The Medrash says, the Almighty was Borei Olamos Umachrivam, was creating worlds and destroying them. Until he created this world, and this he did not destroy. So the commentaries suggest that those worlds that preceded ours, that was part of the previous Shemitah cycles. The world existed for 6,000 years and was destroyed for the 7th, and was rebuilt. God created worlds and destroyed them, created worlds and destroyed them. So 6,000 years, and then the 7th millennium, it was destroyed. And then was recreated 6,000 years, and the 7th millennium was destroyed, and so on. And the commentaries add that the current world that we're in is the last of the Shemitah cycles. So when Adam was created, there were all sorts of worlds that preceded it, specifically 6 different worlds. There was one world that lasted for 6,000 years, and then was destroyed for a 7th millennium. And then there was a second world that was for an additional 6,000 years and was destroyed for the 7th millennium. And so on. 42,000 years after the initial creation, this world was created. And thus, the true age of the universe It's not around 6,000, but it's around 48,000 because there were 42,000 years that preceded the current creation of this world. So I said to the students that we get a little closer, the scientific number and our traditional number. So 6,000 to 15 billion, 48,000 is a little bit closer to 15 billion. We still have work to do maybe to shrink the gap if there's going to be harmony between these two opinions. But then I added the final point. And this point, again, is featured by the ancient sources. This is cited by Rabbi Yitzchak de Min Akko, who lived in the times of the Ramban, so in the 1200s. This is not some sort of new opinion. He was one of the great Kabbalists of all time. And he adds one final wrinkle. And he says that the 42,000 years that preceded Adam, they were not human years, they were godly years. Now, what is a godly year? Well, the verse tells us in Scripture that one day of God is 1,000 years for us. One day of God is 1,000 years for us. So if Genesis is 6 days plus 1, for us, it's 6,000 years plus 1 millennium. Because one day of God is 1,000 years for us. Well, if one day of God is 1,000 years for us, well, how long is 1 year of God? It's 365 and a quarter days. So it's 365,250 years of us. These sources put together, we discover something fascinating. Our world, it's the 7th world that God created. There were 6 worlds that each lasted for 6,000 years plus 1,000 years, meaning for 7,000 years. So our world came after 42,000 years of previous worlds. But those 42,000 years are not human years, they're godly years. Every year of God, when we translate it into our system, it's 365 and a quarter thousand years. Do the math. 42,000 times 365,250. And the number is about 15 billion years. This is a fascinating system that invokes the sources that talk about the worlds that preceded our worlds, and this concept of the Shemitah cycle, and the 7 Shemitah cycles arriving at the year 50,000, which is the cap to this whole enterprise, and the sources that talk about how these previous cycles that preceded Adam were not human years but godly years. And it's wonderful and interesting and fascinating that if you calculate it, it matches the scientific consensus with eerie accuracy. And the final point is that all of these sources are completely reputable. This is cited by the Ramban in this passage Parsha. And it's cited by the Sefer HaChinuch. And it's brought down, again, by some of the most reputable medieval sages. And not a single source is newer than 700 years old. So this is not new stuff. So there's no apologetics here. And I told the girls, I said, listen, it's very heartening to know that Torah and science are always compatible. It's possible you don't understand the Torah. And it's definitely possible that you don't understand the science. Or the science that you have is wrong, based upon mistakes or some sort of conjecture along the way. But both of them are the handiwork of God. Yeah, one's God's mind, so to speak, and one's God's universe, his handiwork. And therefore they must be compatible, they must match. That was the speech that I gave on Friday night after the meal. It was very well received. Now that worked out well, but I really wanted to be on the panel scheduled for Shabbos afternoon. Now, parenthetically, my wife has been teaching in the school for 12 years already. But this past year, this current year, that the year's about to finish, they asked me if I would teach as well twice a week, 40 minutes on Monday and Wednesday mornings to the 11th and 12th graders. So I've been teaching the whole year now, just a couple times a week. So I told the class, I said, listen, I was on the panel last year, but I was disinvited from the panel this year. It's kind of an outrage. I should really be on the panel, don't you think? They launched a public opinion campaign. And there was a groundswell. And ultimately, there was too much pressure, and I was included in the panel. I was added. Would you believe it? It worked. It worked. But I was trying to be more of a team player, On the podcast, you could be a tyrant. You could be a totalitarian dictator. But sometimes in other areas of life, you have to play nice. So I said, you know what? It's a panel, other people there, my co-panelists. I'll try to keep my answers short and not to interject and not to be unnecessarily disagreeable, not to overshadow my co-panelists. But that meant, of course, that I couldn't say everything I wanted to say regarding the subjects that came up on the panel. So I figured, well, I still have a microphone. I still have a platform. Maybe I'll get my chance to fully explicate my opinions on some of the questions that came up on the panel. Now, they had selected several very interesting questions, and it was all about Torah study. Why is it important to study Torah? Why is it such a fundamental part of Jewish life? What about the written Torah and the oral Torah? And maybe we made mistakes and so on. Those sorts of questions. But there's one question that came up, a fascinating, I think very important question as well. Why do we spend so much time studying areas of Torah that are not relevant, that are not practical? Now, this is a very interesting question. And it's one that you can't really answer in like a minute or two. Because I shared the panel with 3 other participants, and then I got like 1 minute or two to opine on all these questions, and then the moderator would pass the baton to the next panelist. And as you know, I'm not a master of brevity. We do long form here. So now we're back at the Torch Center, and now we could address some of these questions without the constraints of the format. And this question, why do we spend so much time studying concepts that are not practical or relevant? I think it's an interesting question. I think it's a fascinating question. It's a particularly topical question. This week is Parsha's Bechukosai. It's the final installment in the book of Leviticus. Now, most years we don't spend as much time on Leviticus because most years, the ordinary year, it's not a leap year, and therefore Tazria Metzora, those 2 parshios are together. Achremos and Kedoshim are together. Behar, Bechukosai are together. This year we had 10 weeks of Leviticus. Each parsha is on its own. And what we're studying, you start off Parshas Vayikra. It's all about sacrifices. The Ola sacrifice, various types of Ola sacrifices, and the Mincha, and the Chatas, and the Asham, and so on. Tzav, it's all about sacrifices. And the laws of the temple, and purity and impurity. There's very little in Leviticus that's something you could do, you could actualize in a practical way in your life today. Of course, we hope the temple's rebuilt and so on. And we can implement all of these laws, but it's an interesting question. Maybe we should spend less time on the things that are less practical. And I told the audience, I said, listen, I had the great privilege of studying the book of Yevamos for 1.5 years of my life. In one yeshiva that I was in when I was 16, we spent an entire year studying the book of Talmud called Yevamos. And then a little bit later on, when I was about 20 or so, I was in a different yeshiva, and we had a half a year studying the book of Yevamos. Now, what is the book of Yevamos about? I've never seen any aspect of this play out in real life, thank God. I don't really know anyone that has any practical experience in this part of the Torah. It talks about Levirate marriages. 2 brothers, one dies without children, and the second brother, he marries the widow, his sister-in-law, his former sister-in-law, and thereby they create a legacy for the departed brother. He died without any children, doesn't leave any lasting legacy in the world. We do yibum. That's the idea of Yevamos, yibum. This system of marriage where the brother marries the widow of his deceased brother. We have an example of it, of course, in Genesis, where the sons of Judah, 2 sons die, and the second brother marries the sister-in-law, marries Tamar, and then when he dies, Judah says, well, the third brother, you don't wait for him. You wait in your father's house. I'll send you a postcard. I'll send you a fax, a telegram when it's time. He's too young. And she, of course, realizes he's trying to just push her away. And she undertakes to do something radical to bear a child from this family. She, of course, impersonates a harlot, and she seduces Judah. And the result of that union are twins, which eventually spawn the line of David and the Messiah. Very interesting subject. But it's not really practical, right? Hopefully most people, won't die without any children. And even if it does happen, tragically, the Talmud says that we don't practice yibum. Instead, they do chalitza, which is the form of divorce in such an instance. So I spent 1.5 years of my life studying Talmud that I cannot think of anything that's practical from it. There isn't a single instance in my life I say, oh, this is Yevamos. Doesn't happen like that. Or Bava Kama. My boys this year in high school, in the Masifta here in the high school. We have Yeshiva high school here in Houston. They are studying a book of Talmud called Bava Kama, which is the first of 3 books of Talmud that deal with interpersonal laws. And it starts off with damages. You cause damage to your friend. Well, how do you cause damage? Well, your animal eats or tramples upon the produce of your neighbor. You're a farmer. They're a farmer. You have an ox. They have an ox. Your ox gores their ox or eats their produce or tramples on their stuff. What do you have to pay? Was it done in a public setting, in a private setting, and so on? All the different laws. Or you leave a stone, and it's a public hazard, and someone trips over it and injures themselves. Some animal walks along the street and stumbles upon your hazard that you place, that you're responsible. Or, God forbid, someone has a fire, and the fire goes and travels and consumes the pile of hay by the neighbor. Or someone personally causes physical damage to their fellow. I heard from one of my teachers, he says he finished the whole book of Bava Kama without ever seeing a bull. He talks about all these bulls and goring and all that. He never saw a grew up in Brooklyn. He never saw an animal. There's no cows there. So there's a lot that we spend in the yeshiva system on parts of Torah that are not practical. And it makes you wonder, why is that done? Now, it needs to be said that every yeshiva has a time in the schedule for halacha, for the practical parts of Torah. But it's minuscule compared to the theoretical parts that we studied from the Talmud. And it raises the question, why? Why do we spend so much time on subject matter that is not practical? Now, I had only 1 minute, and I wanted to speak for an hour. So in my 1 minute, I fired off 3 different answers. The first thing I did, which I like to do, I challenged the question, right? Someone gives you a question. Who's to say that the question is legitimate? Because the question is built from a series of assumptions, and maybe some of the assumptions are wrong or misplaced. So if you ask a question that, why do we study parts of Torah that are not practical, not relevant, you're assuming that that's what we're doing. I said, not practical, not relevant. You're going to find me a page of Torah, a page of Talmud, a line, a word, a letter that's not practical, it's not relevant, that has no lessons for you? I was always trained otherwise. I was trained that there's lessons, practical lessons in every single page of the Talmud. And part of your job when you're studying is not just to study it on a theoretical level, but to bring it down to yourself and try to integrate and assimilate it into your practice, into your behavior, glean some practical lessons from what you study. So the moderator said, well, such as? So I said to them, well, the aforementioned book of Yevamos, what's the subtext of the whole book? The subtext of the whole book is taking responsibility for your brother, for your relative. It's undertaking a mission to create some legacy for your deceased brother. And it's to do it in a way that you're dissociating yourself from it. It's an act of total self-abnegation where you're saying, I'm undertaking a mission that I will glean no benefit. This child that will be born will be attributed not to me, but to my brother. That's an act of tremendous self-sacrifice. And in fact, this is the reason why the Talmud says, already 2,000 years ago, we don't do it. It's very hard to have someone that has this degree of self-sacrifice. But I think more broadly speaking, the question presupposes something which is, I think, a giant misconception. The question assumes that, well, if you have something which is practical, there's some way for you to implement or to execute upon it. Well, that's something you should engage with. If there's nothing that you could do about some piece of Talmud or of Torah, well, then it's not useful. In our Parsha's Bechukosai, we see otherwise. The Parsha begins, Bechukosai telechu, if you shall walk with my statutes, and you observe my mitzvos, and you heed my words, then all sorts of good things will happen to you. You'll have rain, and you'll have bountiful crops, and you'll be secure, and you'll be satiated, and there'll be peace in the land, and your enemies will be destroyed, and there won't be any wild animals that attack, and there won't be war that will debilitate, and you'll be able to overcome and destroy your enemies, and your children will flourish, you'll be fruitful, you'll multiply, you'll have a close connection with the Almighty. He will maintain His covenant with you, and you'll have such abundance, you'll be able to eat all the old produce, and God will dwell amongst you, and He won't reject you, and things will be wonderful. This is one of the two places in the Torah that we're told about the consequences of our choices. If we choose good, things will be swell. But there's the other side of the coin. And that is in the event that we choose poorly and we reject the Almighty and His mitzvos, then all sorts of terrible things will happen. And there's a very famous comment in Rashi. Rashi says, what does it mean to walk with the statutes of the Almighty? It cannot be referring to the observance of mitzvos because that's already addressed explicitly. Mitzvosai tishmoru, you observe my mitzvos. So, if mitzvos have already been addressed, well, what does it mean to go in God's way, in God's laws, to walk with God's statutes? So Rashi says it means to toil in His Torah. What Rashi is telling us is that there is an emphasis to study the Almighty's Torah in a way that's not going to lead to the observance of mitzvos. It's just to spend time with the Almighty, so to speak, in His Torah. And if we do that, we will be rewarded handsomely. And if we do not do that, then, God forbid, all manner of suffering will befall us. And again, the emphasis is not on the mitzvahs, not on the practical, but on the impractical, the parts of the Torah that are not manifested in some sort of practice that we can do. And thus we see explicitly in our Parsha the great emphasis on studying Torah, even if it's not relevant to us in some sort of practical way. So I suggested perhaps another idea, and I want to elaborate on it a bit more today here. Now I'm back here at the Torah. I don't hear any moderator. There's no moderator cutting me off. I tried to jump in and they said, no, you're invited back to the panel, but you gotta behave. But I don't see anyone here. There's no one in the room here. I'm with myself in the Torah Center here. So I could elaborate a bit. I told them that there is a book called the Sefer HaChinuch, which is the book of mitzvos. On our mitzvah podcast, we go through the Sefer HaChinuch, the book of mitzvos. And he has a fascinating introduction to his book. One day we'll do a podcast about the introduction of the Sefer HaChinuch to his magnificent and magisterial work of mitzvos. And he asks this question: why did the Almighty give us the Torah? Mitzvos, we understand that. The Almighty gives us the mitzvos so we know what to do because he wants us to observe, to heed the law. But why such a rich Torah? It's kind of incomprehensible to someone who never had the privilege of studying in the Yeshiva, how you could spend a whole year on the Levirate Marriage, just on that subject. And even then, you're just scratching the surface. Like, what could you possibly talk about for a whole year? And there's books like this written on it. Like this, I'm saying. There are individual books like this. There's entire libraries of books of commentary and analysis and study and insight and novelty on this book of Talmud. So the outsider may think, it's the students in the yeshiva. They go there and they study a little bit and then they go out for a cigarette break and they smoke cigarettes and talk about politics and sports and business and drink some coffee and go back and study a little bit. No, it's a misconception. Students are studying 18 hours a day. Not everyone, of course, and they're completely immersed in this incredible book of Talmud, Yevamos. And it's completely life-changing. And there's so much there. It's a whole universe to explore. And it was given to us by the Almighty. Why did the Almighty give this to us? What is the objective? And of course, this question is compounded by the fact that, for 2,000 years, there hasn't been anyone not anyone, the Talmud says that already 2,000 years ago, they ceased the practice of yibum, of this actual marriage. So it's not practical. And there's been millions and millions and millions of human brain hours spent delving into this book. Why? So Sefer HaChinuch says something unbelievable. He says that the human is a chimera, not his words, is a hybrid. You're half angel, half beast. And the truth is, it's actually more polarized than that. Because your soul, your angelic half, is actually more lofty than all the angels. And your beast, the animalistic half, is more base and coarse and corruptible than the worst of the animals. And all that is within range for the human. And you're torn. And there's tension, and you're being pulled. The objective of Torah is to arm you, to give you the ammunition to swing completely towards the side of angels and to surpass them. If you do nothing, you take no preventative steps, you will slide away. You will be consumed by the animalistic side. You'll become worse than animals, because most animals, they don't do damage. Corrupt humans, not just are they not enlightened and elevated, they do terrible damage, both in the physical domain and certainly in the spiritual domain. So what will determine our fate? How can we ensure that we're going to veer towards our soul and away from our base course impulsivity that is the default? You have to empower the mind. You have to elevate the soul. You have to empower the parts of you that you want to accentuate. And the best way to do that, the best way to sharpen the mind and to hone the intellect and to awaken and empower the soul is with the Almighty's Torah. So if you're looking at the Torah and saying, well, I want to learn the law so I can observe the Almighty's corpus, I can follow His rules. That's true. On one very basic level, that's part of it. But if you're looking at your life as this cosmic, fierce, intense struggle between the two poles that you could become, and you know that everything hinges upon these decisions and these choices and how you're going to live, how you're going to identify, how you're going to interface, what will you become? And everything about your life and your afterlife for all eternity is going to be determined by this. And not just that, the whole world really hangs in a balance. What will happen to the world? Will the humans elevate it, or will the humans corrupt and destroy it? And the Torah, that's the X factor. That's what's going to determine if the person grabs onto the tree of life and doesn't yield the tree of life even for a second and clutches it like his life depends upon it. You're studying Yevamos and you've never seen a Levirate marriage. You stand above a cow, you don't know what a cow looks like. But what you're doing is completely transformational. It's pushing you like a runaway train towards becoming an angel. It's developing your spiritual half, your intellectual half. And it's determining your fate and the fate of everyone around you. I didn't quite have the time to elaborate like I did today, but that's an important element here. That's what we're doing with the Torah study that we're doing. Outsiders look at it and say, well, you just study the Torah and give you the instructions for how to do it, how to implement, how to live this ritual, this religion. And that's true on a very small level. But when you understand what the objective is, what the challenge is, what the tension is, what the human dilemma is, and you understand what role the Torah plays, you realize that this is not impractical at all. This is life and death here. Behold, I have placed before you hachaim vehatov, life and goodness on one side, and death and all manner of evil on the other side. We have to choose where we're going, and what will determine that we'll make successful choices to the degree that we cleave to the Almighty's Torah, that will push us to become angels and to elevate ourselves and the world around us. And that's just one idea. It's impractical. We're finishing up Leviticus here. Sacrifices, this sacrifice and that sacrifice. Purity, the Metzorah. Imagine trying to do a podcast on this, okay? Don't complain. Don't complain. You have to study, It's so boring. Imagine to do a podcast on Tazria and Metzorah, 2 separate episodes. You don't want to repeat content from previous years. Don't complain. Okay? Just kidding. It's okay to complain a little bit. Send me an email, rabbi@wallbridge.com with all your complaints. Leviticus. Like we're departing from Leviticus. And it's kind of bittersweet because we've been in this world now for 10 weeks. And it's beautiful and it's powerful and it's transformational. And this is only the beginning. Lowly human can foster a bond, a connection with Almighty God. Which is just a crazy thing to ponder. There's only one power in all of existence. There's truly one thing that exists, and everything else doesn't really exist. It only exists so long and is insofar as the one thing that does exist wills and determines that those other things exist. There's only one thing in the world. It's only Hashem. That's it. Only the Almighty. Everything else that exists only because the Almighty wants it to exist. And every little bug and every large star and every granule of sand, it doesn't really exist. It only exists because the Almighty determines and wills it to exist. And us, lowly, fragile, frail, fallible, and mortal human, we can foster a bond with Almighty God. And the way we do that, better than any other way, is via the Torah. So again, if you're thinking about the Torah, so let me learn the laws. That's true on a very small level. But ultimately, if you were to distill what we're trying to do over here, you would say the answer is two things: love God and fear God. Those are the endpoints of all of our efforts. And how do we do that? How do we love God? Torah. How do we fear God? Torah. There's a famous piece in Rambam's delineation of mitzvos where he describes how a person can love God. It's a very hard mitzvah. Think about it. How do you love God? We have such a hard time even conceptualizing it. We, in fact, are unable to conceptualize God. The finite cannot grasp the infinite. It's not possible. We are designed in a way that it's not possible for us to think on that dimension. Yet we have to love God. Says the Rambam. God himself, on a theological level, is unfathomable to us. But he gave us a present, a gift that he had stored in his treasure house for 974 generations before the world was created. And that gift is his Torah. And the Torah is formatted in a way that we can understand. And Torah includes within it the essence, so to speak, of the Almighty. So you want to love God, you first have to understand God. You try the theological route, you won't understand God and you won't love God either. But there's another route. There's another path. And that is the path of the Torah. And you study Torah, and you delve into it, and you cogitate and ruminate upon it. You are entering the world, the universe of the Almighty. And to the degree that you understand Torah, you understand God. And to the degree you understand God, you love him. And you're completely transformed as a result. Because you're a human now. But you're operating, you're living, you're breathing on a different level than anyone else. Because once a human forges a connection with the Almighty, they're a forever altered, radically altered human. How do I love God? You should love Hashem your God with all your hearts, with all your soul, with all your resources. The very next verse tells us how to do it. V'hayu hadvarim ha'ela, these words that I placed upon your heart. You study Torah. That is how you love the Almighty. It's not practical. It's a very narrow view of what Torah is supposed to be. Torah is supposed to change us fundamentally, comprehensively, and permanently. And the end point is love of God and fear of God as well. And the way you do that is via his Torah. And the Mishnah tells us that if there are 10 people who are studying Torah together, the Shekhinah is with them. And even if it's 5 people, and even if it's 3 people, even if it's 2 people, even if it's one person themselves. You're by yourself, and you're studying the Almighty's Torah. The Mishnah tells us that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is with you. I was studying with a friend of mine the book of Jeremiah. And on the commentary, it cites the very famous teaching in the Midrash. Based upon the verse in Jeremiah, the Midrash says, if only the Jews abandoned God. They should abandon God, but not abandon His Torah. Because if a Jew abandons God, but clings to the Torah, maintains a deep affinity and connection with the Almighty's Torah, the light inherent in the Torah will bring them back to God. Torah is inseparable from the Almighty. And there's nothing more practical for us in life than trying to create a connection with our Creator. And the way we do that is via His Torah. So it's a good question. But the premise is flawed. We are so fortunate to study the Almighty's Torah. We get to do it here each week. It's a privilege. Of course, it's a pleasure. We're wrapping up Leviticus. And people may argue, well, it's kind of impractical. We have to remember that nothing, absolutely nothing, bonds us closer with our Creator than studying His Torah. That's what we do here every week. And it's worthwhile to remember how fortunate we are to have that. How lucky we are that we're part of the 0.01% of the world that's even aware of this. You know, we're driving back from the Shabbaton last night, and I had a van full of cranky kids, and they said, put on something to listen to. So I put on a Harry Potter audiobook, and it's magical. The real magic is it keeps everyone quiet. So we were listening to one of the first chapters of the book. And you probably, I assume most of y'all know the story. But there's a kid, come from this magical family, and his parents die under unfortunate circumstances. He's raised by his aunt and uncle who mistreat him. But it turns out he's also a wizard. He just doesn't know about it. And he gets invited to join the school because he's a wizard. I'm sorry if I'm spoiling it, but this is like 25 years old, okay? Okay, it's been part of the zeitgeist for a very long time. But anyhow, he gets invited to go to the school. And he has a kind of his aunt and uncle. They're not thrilled about this. And they very much want to keep him, away from all this mishigas. So they don't tell him that he's a wizard, and they try to hide all the envelopes that come to him from the school. Until finally this massive, massive guy, like a giant with enormous hair, just shows up and kind of bullies his aunt and uncle. And he tells Harry, he's like, well, you're a wizard. He's like, what? What does that even mean? How do we ask me all these questions? And I was thinking last night, I'm like, that's us. We're the wizards. Our people. We were part of this. We're descending from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We went through Egypt and we ate the manna. We were privy to the Sinai revelation. But there are many of us that don't know this. And they don't realize that, we have to go to wizarding school. Got to go to the Yeshiva. I got to learn about Torah. Got to develop and deepen our connection that we have, at least in potential, that we have with Hashem. But of course, here from the Torah, we're trying to reverse that one week at a time. We're trying to study together. I appreciate your listenership. I hope you have a wonderful, fantastic, and splendid day. A fantastic fantastic week, an amazing Shabbos. And of course, I look forward to your questions, your comments, your feedback. And as always, the email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.